All right, Unit 4. So in Unit 4, we're going to mainly be talking about word problems, but in order to get to solving word problems, we need to review adding and subtracting fractions. So that's what we are going to do in this video, is review those skills that you learned last year in 5th grade. So do me a favor, in the front of your notebook where you have your units of study, add in Unit 4, the SOLs that we're covering, and then the first topic that we're going to cover is adding and subtracting fractions. Once you get that copied in the first part, turn in your notebook until you come to 2 empty pages that are side by side. Write Unit 4 word problems on the right hand side, and then you can fold down that corner so you know where to find Unit 4. And then once you're on to that page, you can start copying in your notes for fractions. So here are all the steps for adding and subtracting fractions. And if you want to pause the video here so that you can copy these in, that would be great. This is a review from 5th grade. So your first step when you add and subtract fractions, and I don't know if your 5th grade teacher taught you this, we're going to say add, subtract, stack, and rack. And multiply, divide, we're always going to work side to side. It just rhymes, and that way it's a little cue for your brain. So add, subtract, stack, and rack, that's step 1. We're going to turn them in proper and do that magic C if needed. We're going to use our multiplication chart to find a common denominator. Then we will add or subtract to the numerators. We're going to keep the denominator that we worked really hard for. And then we're going to simplify our fraction just like we had to do with multiplication and division. You may leave your numbers as improper fractions, and you may use a multiplication chart. Please use your multiplication chart. There is one linked in our page. You can also just pull one offline. So let's follow our steps. The first step said add, subtract, stack, and rack. So I'm going to stack up these fractions, and it's plus 3/4. The next step was do magic C to turn improper if needed, and we don't have any improper fractions, so we're going to skip that step. Step 3 is find a common denominator. So my denominators are 3 and 4. So if I look at those denominators and I look at my multiplication chart, I can look across the 3 row and the 4 row together. I'm looking for a number that shows up in both the 3 row and the 4 row of the multiplication chart. And the smallest number that shows up in both the 3 row and the 4 row would be the denominator of 12. So now I know that both 3 and 4 can make 12. Well, the question you have to ask yourself is, what do you need to multiply times 4 to make 12? And what do you have to multiply times 3 to make 12? Well, I'm going to start with the 4. I need to multiply 4 times 3 to make 12. And whatever I do to the bottom of a fraction, I also have to do to the top. So 3 times 3 then, to change my fraction, would be a 9. Now I'm going to ask myself, I'm going to change my colors. What do I need to multiply times this 3 to make 12? Well, 3 times 4 is 12, and whatever I do the bottom, I also have to do the top. So 2 times 4 gives me 8. So now I have 8/12 and 9/12, and I can combine those 12s together because it's addition. So I'm going to write that as 8 plus 9, and I worked really hard for that denominator of 12, so I'm going to keep it. Then I'm going to add 8 plus 9, and that gives me 17/12. And 17 is what's called a prime number, meaning it only multiplies by 1 and 17 to make itself. So I'm just going to leave it as 17/12 as my answer. You do not need to turn it back into a mixed number. Okay, so let's look at another one. Our next one is actually a subtraction problem. Add, subtract, stack, and rack. And it's subtraction. And I always draw my subtraction sign a little bit darker so I remember it's subtraction. Step 2 is magic C if needed. So I'm going to turn this sucker in proper. multiply at the bottom, add at the top, get mad. 2 times 1 is 2, plus 1 more gives me 3. So now I have 3 over 2. And you can bop over this 5/6 so it's underneath. Now I have to look at that denominator. I have a 2 and a 6. So I'm going to look across the 2 row and across the 6 row. And you could start with the 2 row. The first digit in the 2 row on a multiplication chart would be 2. Well, does 2 show up in the 6 row? No. The next digit would be 4. Does 4 show up in the 6th row? No. The next digit would be 6. Does 6 show up in the 6th row? Well, it does. So what that means is I can change this 2 to have a denominator of 6. And because 5/6 already has a denominator of 6, I can just keep dragging it across. Now I have to see, okay, 2 times what is 6? 2 times 3 would be 6, according to the multiplication chart. 3 times 3 would be 9, because whatever I do to the bottom, I also have to do to the top. Now remember, this is subtraction, so I'm going to subtract my numerators, keep the denominator that we worked really hard for. 9 minus 5 gives me 4 over 6. Just keep dragging that 6 across. And then the last step is to simplify. Well, these two numbers are even, so I can divide them by 2. And that gives me 2/3 as my final answer. So if you need to rewind through both of these examples, rewatch them. I'm going to have you try the next one on your own. So add, subtract, stack, and rack, turn in proper, find a common denominator, add your numerators, keep the denominator, and then simplify. So go ahead and try this one on your own. So add, subtract, stack, and rack. I'm going to turn this guy in proper. 6 times 1 is 6, plus 5 gives me 11 over 6. I'm just going to drag over the 5/12 to keep everything stacked. Now I have to look at my denominators. I have a 12 and I have a 6. Look across the 12 row and the 6 row at the same time. Start with the 6 row. The first digit that's in the 6 row on the multiplication chart would be 6. Does 6 show up in that 12 row? No. The second number in the 6th row would be 12. Well, 12 shows up in the 12th row. So what that means is that I can keep my first fraction and just leave them alone and just drag them across like a bin. But I need to change the denominator of the second one to 12 because I have to have the same denominator in order to combine them. 6 times 2 would give me 12, and whatever I do to the bottom, I have to do to the top. 11 times 2 would be 22. Combine, so I have 5 plus 22 over that denominator of 12 that I worked really hard for. 5 plus 22 would give me 27 over 12. That simplifies. You can divide by 3. Gives me 9 over 4, which no longer simplifies. So that's as far as that one goes. And the last one that we're going to do in our video is this one. Remember, it is subtraction. Go ahead, you try this one on your own. Stack and rack, magic C, common denominator, subtract, and simplify. So add, subtract, stack, and rack, magic C, multiply at the bottom, add at the top. 3 times 3 is 9, plus 1 more gives me 10 over 3. I'm going to drag over 4/9 since I haven't had to change it yet. Now I have to look at my denominators. I have a 3 and a 9. So in my multiplication chart, I'm going to look at the 9 row and the 3 row. I'm going to start with the 3 row and check to see what shows up in 9. So the first digit in the 3 row will be a 3. That doesn't show up in the 9 row. The second digit in the 3 row would be a 6. 6 doesn't show up in the 9 row of the multiplication chart. The third number in the multiplication chart would be a 9, and 9 shows up in there. So I can leave 4/9 alone, but I have to change this guy to have a denominator of 9. Well, what times 3 gives you 9? Well, 3 times 3 gives me 9. Whatever I do at the bottom, I have to do to the top. 10 times 3 is 30. Remember, this one is subtraction. So I have 30 minus 4 over 9. Keep the denominator. You worked really hard for it. 30 minus 4 gives me 26. Oops. 26 over 9. Those numbers don't simplify, so you can leave it as 26 over 9. If you have any questions about adding and subtracting fractions, don't forget to ask your teacher. And thank you for your hard work in copying your notes down.